So this morning I want to focus on Paul's prayer for this church. This prayer can be used for anyone, at any time, anywhere. And if you don't know what to pray, take this prayer and pray it for the people that you're praying for. The thing that he focuses on is God's will. And that's what I want to focus on this morning. I want to ask 3 questions. So the first question we're going to ask is, what is God's will? Verse 9 says, for this reason, since the day we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you and asking God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through all spiritual wisdom and understanding. So what is God's will and what does it look like? Well, Jesus was very clear, wasn't he, that he came to do God's will. He said in John 6 verse 38, I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but the will of him who sent me. And we know that in the Garden of Gethsemane he really struggled with God's will. But he ended up saying, yet not as I will, but as you will. So the question I want to ask you this morning, I want to tease your thinking of it, is God's will like a tightrope? Is it something we have to sort of balance on? Is it something that's really difficult? You know, that if we miss God's will, we've fallen off completely, we've failed and there's no plan B. Is that what God's will is? Is that what God's will is like? I've got a few shaking of the head. The meaning of this word will is not actually about obeying strict rules and regulations, but rather it's about choosing to live our lives in a way that brings God pleasure. So I'd like us to think of God's will as anything that brings him pleasure. Now, that's not a tightrope, is it? And in Romans 12 verse 2, the Good News Bible puts it this way, don't conform yourselves to the standard of this world, but let God transform you inwardly by a complete change of your mind. Then you will be able to know the will of God, what is good and is pleasing to him and is perfect. So doing God's will is doing what pleases him. So I prefer to think about God's will as being like a playground. Now a playground's got a fence around it usually, but there's lots of room. You can go wherever you like. You can play on the swings, you can play in the sand pit, you can go down the slide, and it's really fun. Of course, there are times when God does speak to us directly and specifically about what he wants us to do. And I found that particularly as a young Christian, God would often give me clear direction about this or that. But I can still remember the day when God said to me, you choose. I'm like, what? Me? Choose? Oh, okay. Well, that required in me a bit of a different skill. It wasn't just about hearing what God was saying. It was about knowing what God was saying and interpreting that and deciding what was going to be best for him and for me. So as I grew in the Lord, I found that there was more choice, and I learned to operate within the sphere, within the playground of his reign, as I learned to obey the promptings of his Holy Spirit. So Paul prayed that his readers would have a knowledge of what pleased God by having spiritual wisdom and understanding. These 2 words go together. You can have all the wisdom in the world, but it can make no difference to how you conduct yourself. For example, I know that my kitchen knife is sharp, but one day I cut a big chunk off my finger. My knowledge made no difference to my action, and I suffered from that. In fact, I said to Warren, I feel a bit sick, I think I have to go and lie down. I'm a nurse who's used to dealing with gory things. But my knowledge made no difference to my action. The kind of wisdom that Paul's talking about here is where the penny drops for you. It clicks for you. It makes sense. It becomes what I'd like to call a baseline default belief. It becomes what we call a first principle. So we all have first principles. That is wisdom that comes from the beliefs that underlie our actions. If we truly believe something, it will come out in the way we act. And this is where understanding comes in. Sometimes we say about people, they just don't get it. And we're not usually being polite, are we? They know something, but their knowledge doesn't inform their actions. Understanding is about getting it. It's about learning to apply these principles in real life. Spiritual understanding is supernatural, it comes from God, and it implies that the Holy Spirit will help us to understand how to apply spiritual truth or spiritual principles in our everyday lives. Now that might look different for different people. The principle's the same, but how it's worked out in our lives might be slightly different depending on our circumstances or the kind of person we are or where we live or the kind of background we've got or the family that we find ourselves in or the kind of work we do. It's going to work out differently, but that's the key. If we understand the principles, then we can ask God to give us that spiritual understanding so that we're working out in our everyday life.